Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and in this video I want to talk about something kind of seasonal, which is the origin of the word Yule, or Old Norse Yule, or Yule in most of the modern Scandinavian languages, still Yule in Icelandic. The way that it's related to some surprising other words, although its origins are not exactly definitively confirmed. And I also want to kind of address a question from a Patreon supporter, Cole, about hapaxes, words that occur only once. So as far as accounting for the name Yule, I'll mostly use the Old Norse name in this video. The traditional account has been that it is related to the word hjól, which means wheel, right? And that makes some intuitive sense, that it's a point in the year in which the wheel of the year has reached a certain point that it reaches every year, a starting point. But even though this is probably the most usual etymology that you'll encounter for this word, and it's possible that in 9 years and 1,300 videos, even I've repeated this at some point, I have no idea. I can't keep track of everything I've said at this point. It's not a very good account because that H needs to go somewhere. It is actually not usual. There's some kind of animal moving behind me somewhere. For an H to just disappear in Old Norse, right? This isn't London English. This isn't the history of Latin. There's no real H dropping that is common in Scandinavia for the most part. Certainly not in the Proto-Norse dialect that would lead to Old Norse and to the later Scandinavian languages. And that H would also have to come from a K at an earlier stage of the language, in Proto-Indo-European. And we can't find any good cognates for that. A cognate is a word that comes from the same ancestor word in another language. But as I've dug around for alternative explanations for where this word might come from, I was surprised to see a suggestion from Norwegian scholar Sufus Bugge back in the 19th century that I thought was perfectly solid and on the right track. This is a little bit unusual for him because Bugge could get a little nutty about etymologies. By far not the worst of these 19th century guys. I mean, I respect a lot of Bugge's scholarship, especially about the manuscript of the Poetic Edda. But, you know, he could get a little zany. We all can. We all speculate some, and that's fine as long as you identify what you're doing as speculating. But he suggested that actually the cognate of this word outside of the Germanic languages is Latin jocus, i.e. the word that gives us joke. Now, this may seem a little bit implausible, but if you know Grimm's law, the sound change that governs the difference between consonants in Germanic languages and consonants in other Indo-European languages, a K in another Indo-European language is equal to an H in a Germanic language like English or Old Norse. Where is the H in Yule? Well, it's there in Old English. In some forms of the word Yule, as preserved in Old English, it is actually spelled with an H, as for example, Jehol. And we know that H used to be there in Old Norse because it's borrowed into Finnish with an H. The Finnish word juhla is party, feast, a celebration that one invites people to, which is exactly what Yule is in an Old Norse context or a modern Scandinavian context. Also, that Finnish word is often plural, and interestingly, the Old Norse word is a plural, right? It's not treated as a plural today. If you say, you know, god jul in Norwegian, that's, you know, have a good Yule, a good Christmas. The word is just used for Christmas today. But it is plural in Old Norse and still in modern Icelandic. Now, that plurality is related, apparently, to the fact that it is celebrated across multiple days, starting on a day called Hokunoat, is usually the form in which you'll see this cited. Now, the manuscripts in which Hokunoat is mentioned in association with Yule spell it 4 frickin' different ways, so it's not actually certain that it is Hokunoat. And unfortunately, it is one of these hapaxes. A hapax is a word that occurs only one time. So we cannot be 100% sure if it is Hokunoat, which looks like chin night, chin of what. My suspicion is that based on all of the variant spellings that occur with a K and a G and all these different vowels, the original might have in fact been Hogunoat, which would be night of blows, like death blows, and that this would then be analogous to the names of winter months in a lot of different traditions, like in Dutch, archaic Slachtmaand, right, the slaughter month for November, or Finnish Marrasku, which means something very similar for November, or Welsh Tachwedd, which means something very similar for November, right, calling November like blood month or slaughter month. And the reason it's called that is not because that's when you have your heavy metal concerts, it's because that's when you slaughter the cattle that you don't want to support through the rest of the winter. But when you have a big slaughter of these cattle, you also tend to have a big feast, and that probably inspires part of the notion of celebrating a big winter feast somewhere in early-ish winter, November, December, January. Okay, so back to the plurality of Yule. Yule is said in the few sources in Old Norse that really talk about how it's celebrated in the pre-Christian period. It is said to last over multiple days. So the most comprehensive account of pre-Christian Yule is in the saga of Håkon the Good, or Håkon, the foster son of Adalstein, where we read of him, a Christian king, that he set it in laws to begin the celebration of Yule at the same time as Christian men. So at his time in the mid-900s, we're already referring to both the Christian celebration of Christmas and the heathen celebration as the same thing. Both of them are being called Yule. But this also implies that Yule is not being held at exactly the same time as Christmas, which I want to come back to. And every man should have a certain measurement of ale, a mallir of ale. It's really hard to tell what that is, but it appears to be multiple gallons. And he should pay a fine otherwise, and hold the time holy while the ale was progressed through. So basically it's a holiday as long as you're drinking this large amount of ale that each man is supposed to drink. But in earlier times, the celebration of Yule had begun on Hokunoat, or Hogunoat, whatever it is. This is where that hapax, that word occurring one time, comes from. That was midwinter night, and Yule was celebrated for 3 nights. And indeed, most of the time when we see references to pre-Christian Yule, we read about, like the first night of Yule, second night of Yule, etc. So it's clearly something that's held not just on one day. So it might be the winter solstice, but elsewhere in Old Norse sources, it looks like it's actually something that is later than Christian Christmas. In fact, it looks like it may be in January as midwinter night, traditionally before the scientific observance of exactly when the shortest night of the year was, tended to put midwinter night as something that Icelanders designated sometime in January. I wonder if it is in fact the first full moon after the winter solstice. So it's really hard, if you don't have scientific measurements or even just clocks, to tell exactly what the shortest night of the year is, but you can definitely get an impression of roughly when the shortest nights of the year are, in late December, early January. And so the first full moon after that would then be the beginning of a new month. And because month in an old Germanic sense is the moon, right? Month is derived from moon. We still have some traditional words for months like harvest moon, etc. So I actually wonder if that's what it is. This slaughter night, the night that you kill the cattle that you're not going to support through the winter, is the first full moon after the shortest days of the year. And then for 3 nights, you have a festival of feasting and drinking apparently a very large amount of ale or mead. And that is a holy time because you're enjoying a bounty. Drinking is often associated with religious acts, religious boasting, religious oaths. And you're at the beginning of, you know, a new time of the year, even if the word doesn't mean, you know, wheel. The year has turned to a point that recurs every time, so you're celebrating a new year, or at least a new phase of the year. I think that's a pretty plausible account of when Yule might be. But let's talk also a little bit about this word and how it might relate to joke and some other words that might be surprising to you. But first, let me remind you that during this Yule season, you might be looking for appropriate Yule gifts. And of course, I hope that you'll consider my good friends at Grimfrost, who make great replica Viking stuff and also sell authentic Viking and Old Norse gear, including a lot of stuff with runic phrases that yours truly has translated. They also sell my books. And during the month of December, they have special discounts every day on different items. So check grimfrost.com, see what they've got on special today. And if you get something for a friend or loved one, let them know that you heard about them from me. Okay, so once again, I mentioned jocus, the word that we borrow into joke, as being a potential cognate to to Old Norse Yule, English Yule, with that H that was formerly in the word, as we see in Old English, or in the borrowing from a very early stage of Norse into Finnish, indicates that these words, by Grimm's law, may in fact be cognates. Well, there are other cognates from the same root, which appears to be Proto-Indo-European yolk. The difference between the E and the O is called ablaut. Indo-European roots come in both an E grade and an O grade, so it's the same root whether it has the E vowel or the O vowel. Ablaut is the same thing that gives us the difference between sing and sang, drink and drank. We have Welsh yaith, which means language, Tocharian B yask, which means beg or plead, Sanskrit yachati, which means asks, requests, offers. We have Old Frisian yan or yain. These next ones are actually Germanic languages, so close to Old English, Old Norse. That means admit, plead guilty. We have Old High German yehan, admit, confess, testify, clearly related, and Old Saxon yehan, affirm. Supposedly there's also an Old English cognate to these verbs, but I can't find it in an actual dictionary of Old English. I just see it cited as if it's something that I should know where to find, so it may not actually be there. It may just be people repeating something they've seen cited 12 other places, never sourced. Now, this strongly points toward a verbal root that has something to do with speaking. It could be specifically like speaking happily, as something like, you know, joke, jocus, or Yule, a time when you speak happily, you're celebrating, might imply. But my suspicion is that really it's just a root that meant speak or say. Most languages have tons of roots for the same thing. I mean, just think of all the ways you can say it in English today. You can say speak, you can say, you can say tell, you can say narrate, you can say dictate, you can say relate, you can say retell. Most languages have lots and lots of ways of saying say, right? Old Norse is segja, kveda, nala. Lots and lots of languages have multiple words for this, and probably Proto-Indo-European did too. And it's very natural and normal for words for say or speak to eventually become specialized. So consider, for example, how English borrows a very basic root for say in Latin and gets the word dictate, which has two very specific senses that are not, you know, just say. They're, you know, give an order imperiously, or they're, you know, say something aloud for someone to write down. In the same way, I suspect that this yek word gets very specific associations in the different descendant languages. And it seems that in Latin, it gets that sense of like speak jokingly or speak very happily, because jocus is it's a joke or a jest. Interestingly, language related to Latin, Umbrian, has the same word, probably singular, euka, meaning prayer. Lithuanian actually, by the way, has juokas, which means laugh, so it's kind of a similar looking thing to Latin, where it's gotten specialized to mean speak happily. I suspect that that's just what's happened. You speak happily when you're joking, and you speak happily when you're speaking to the gods. So I think Lithuanian and Latin have probably independently specialized the verbal root for say that way. In Germanic languages, it actually seems to have been specialized to mean something like admit or confess, as we see in these verbs in Old Frisian, Old High German, and Old Saxon. And there is even, here's another hotbox for you, Cole, or other people who are interested in this sort of language stuff. There is even a tiny trace of this in Old Norse, a trace of this old strong verb in Old Norse, in a hotbox that occurs in one stanza of Arnbjarnar Kveða, one of the poems by Egil Skallagrimsson, composed in the 900s and included in the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, where Egil says, at least in some manuscripts, I'm going to quote from IB 169 Quarto, page 18v, a manuscript of Egil Saga that's very good, although written fairly late in the 1700s, where we read, Han alderteg ega gats, fjoljoen fredispjolu. So we're praising Arnbjorn after his death. Arnbjorn, of course, we're praising as a warrior, and we say he got to own an allotment of life, much admitted, much confessed in, and hard to know, we've got to admit the cases of Fredispjolu somehow, but it could be much admitted, much confessed, much told of in tales of unpeace, if we make that O Fridar, or in losses of peace, Fridar Spjolum, or in unpeace news, O Frith Spjolum, something like that. But at any rate, he is much talked about when we talk about there not being peace, a destruction of peace, or news of unpeace, or something like that. And that appears to be the past participle of this old strong verb, at least according to Ewald de Dane. By the way, that article is in volume 3 of Archiv for Nordisk Filologi. Much alluded to is this hotbox, but very few people point to the article in which that conclusion is reached. So that's where you can find it. It's from the 1880s or something, but it's pretty solid philology. So I wonder actually if this admit, confess, kind of legally testify sense is actually how it was specialized in Germanic. And if Yule is not like Latin jocus, from a specialized sense of speak happily, but rather from a specialized sense of confess, admit, perhaps make an oath, right? Testify, make some kind of legal testimony, because we read, for example, in the saga of Hervor and Haethreck, which I translated in my book, Two Sagas of Mythical Heroes, or in Helga Kviða Hjörvarðssonar, one of the heroic poems of the Poetic Edda, which of course I've translated and is now available in a much expanded and revised and improved second edition. We read in both those sources and in many more of men swearing binding, the most sacred, unbreakable oaths during the Yule feasts. So I wonder if that's actually where this originally comes from, is that this is the time for oaths, and perhaps also other kinds of sacral or legal speech, confessions, particularly sacred witness testimony, something like that. It's a possibility. It's also a possibility that, just like in Latin, it got specialized to something like the time when one speaks happily, but I somewhat doubt that that's the original sense. It's also interesting to note that in at least one old poem, Holløygetal, by Øyvind der Skaldespiller, sometimes called Øyvind the Plagiarist, so this would be mid-900s, we have poetry referred to as Jolna Symb, the drink of the Joln, with Joln used as a name of the gods, right? So the drink of the gods, that's poetry, because Odin went and fetched the meat of poetry that makes someone a poet. Now that word Yoln appears to be made from that same exact root that's in Yule, but with the addition of a nominalizing suffix that we also see in a word like wagon or Old Norse wagon. So in other words, the Yoln are the ones who speak in the Yule way, and I wonder if that's actually the ones who make binding oaths rather than the ones who celebrate Yule. In a similar way, Odin is Yolnir, using a different suffix that often comes to have an agentive sense. So the one who, perhaps not celebrates Yule as such, but the one who makes oaths, makes confessions, makes testimonies, something of that kind. A little bit ironic for Odin as a god who breaks his oaths, but still seems like a fairly appropriate derivation for that name. I doubt very much the account that we read in Algrep, the late 1100s Norwegian summary of the history of the kings of Norway, that the season of Yule is named for Odin as Yolnir. I think that's kind of Christological thinking, or someone says, well, Christians celebrate Christ on Christmas, so heathens celebrated Odin on Yule. I don't think that there's a one-for-one analogy that seems likely there, but that's very typical of medieval Christian thinking. One other very interesting word that has been associated with Yule, but I think kind of unfortunately wrongly, is French jolie. So happy is its original sense, right? That's borrowed into English. It's like jolly, although in modern French, generally pretty rather than happy. You will find, including, for example, on major dictionaries, like on the Centre National de Ressources Textuelles et Lexicales, folks, I try to pronounce French, you will find the etymology of this word given as from Old Norse Yule. So when you're jolie, originally, jolly, happy, you're in the mood that you would be in celebrating Christmas or Yule. That's tempting. It would account for the French word fairly well. I don't know, what exactly the mechanism is proposed for this word coming into French that way. How many people in France in the Middle Ages knew what Yule was? Certainly some in Normandy. So it's not an impossible derivation, but I've been talking about this with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Luke Gordon at the University of New Mexico, and I agree with him that it seems a little bit of a stretch. And he proposed, especially based on the fact that there is a clear Italian cognate that wouldn't be accounted for coming from a Old Norse word with a vowel O, or a French word with a vowel O, which is julivo, which means the same thing, that this is in fact from July. The word July, Latin Julius or its descendants in French and Italian, and that this is not the mood you have at Christmas, but the mood you have in July. The mood, it's the summertime of the year, summertime of your days, summertime of your life. You're happy, you're joyous, you're outside because it's warm and there's enough to eat. And I suspect that he's probably right about that. But it's not impossible that the etymology of jolly or jolie does go back to Old Norse Yule, in which case, when we talk about Santa being a jolly old elf, we are in fact weirdly using a old word for the celebration at about the same time of year that the pagan Norse held. Even though Santa Claus is for sure not based on Odin, as common as that story is. I made a whole other video about that a few years ago around this time of year. Well, that wandered all over the place, but I hope that that was an interesting dive into the history of this word. Thank you, Patreon, for your continued support. Thank you, folks, for checking out my books. And keep in mind that I am offering elementary Old Norse, intermediate Old Norse, and reading and writing runes as Zoom classes on the weekends of January and February 2026. I'll put links to those in the video description, probably in a pinned comment, so check them out if you're interested. They are good deals considering how many tens of thousands you would pay to take those at a university and how few universities offer them anyway. But for now, from beautiful Colorado, let me wish you a happy Yule, or whatever holiday you celebrate, as the days get longer again. And from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.